Hello everyone. As you already know, my name is Jasmine Kieft and I'm hosting this climate psychology webinar. I'm a clinical psychologist registrar and also on the leadership team at the Climate Justice Union here in Western Australia. Before we go any further, I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land I'm presenting from, the Whadjuk Noongar people. I wish to acknowledge their continuing culture and recognise their strength, resilience and capacity. I pay my respects to them and their culture and to elders both past and present. So welcome. Today's webinar is an active response to the recent psychological research released through the University of Cumbria to support the Scholars Warning Initiative. The paper is entitled "The Responsibility of Communicating Difficult Truths About Climate-Influenced Societal Disruption and Collapse, an Introduction to Psychological Research." This was included in the original invite to this webinar and will also be available in the resource package following this event. This research recognised the growing emotional responses to the impact climate change is and will continue to have on our environment and our societies. Without going into too much detail, this paper highlighted the importance of engaging with our emotions, collectively supporting each other, and scaffolding open communication on the impact climate change is having and will continue to have on our societies. Today's presenters are all working within their spheres to do just that. These are people and organisations who are dedicating themselves to supporting people and systems emotionally through this issue. This webinar is a relationship building and knowledge sharing opportunity for everyone. So for presenters and those who are watching, if you hear anything that sparks your interest and you want to know more, I encourage you to reach out to that person following this webinar so that we can establish ourselves as a global community and model what it means to support each other collectively. The presentations that you will see will be divided into 3 different sections that represent different approaches to providing emotional support. So we'll begin with systemic support, and then we have support for adults and groups, and then we'll finish with support for children and parents. Following the presentations is a question and discussion time, and all questions will be saved for this time. So I ask anyone who has questions along the way to write them directly into the chat box to myself, and I ask that you include who you're directing the question to in there as well. So I'll be keeping out for questions coming through, and then during the question and answer time, I'll call your name out, and then if you can turn your microphone on and ask your question. So during that time, please listen carefully for your name. So without further ado, we begin section 1, systemic support, and we start with Merle Conyer. Now, Mel supports individuals, teams, organisations and communities responding to interpersonal, institutional, political, cultural and environmental trauma. She is an independent practitioner offering counselling, supervision, debriefing and training in diverse contexts. Mel is active in raising the climate crisis and therapeutic implications with professionals within mental health and social services. She facilitates groups for communities concerned about the climate crisis and actively advocates for climate justice outcomes. Her track record includes service delivery, management and board positions, and she holds a Masters of Counselling and Applied Psychotherapy, Master of Education and Master of Narrative Therapy and Community Work. So I will hand over to you, Mel.
Thank you so much, Jasmine, and hello to everybody. I'm here on Duringa land and pay respects to the custodians of this land and to the lands that you're all on. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you an initiative that took place in January and February last year. I was engaged by 2 Australian universities, one in New South Wales and one in Queensland, to design and lead events with academics in schools of counselling, psychology, social work and education. They were planning for the start of the academic year, and we were in the middle of those terrible fires along our eastern seaboard. I facilitated a variety of presentations and workshops with the academics, as well as a curriculum planning day. And how I oriented it was that I anchored it in the following inquiry. The students entering university now are going to graduate into a changed world due to global heating. How do we prepare to support children and adults and students and each other for the future that is coming and the changing world in which we are living? And how does this inform pedagogic and curricular considerations and research priorities? In setting the scene, I positioned the climate crisis as a justice issue informed by intersecting systems of oppression. I outlined how climate risks are not evenly created or distributed and ways they amplify existing vulnerabilities and social injustices. I quoted Hopkins, who said, "We will never survive the climate crisis without ending white supremacy. And here's why. You can't have climate change without sacrifice zones, and you can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people, and you can't have disposable people without racism." This orientation broadened the discussion from an environmental concern to a movement for civil rights and anti-racist realignment of social, cultural, health and educational structures. And the participants were invited to reflect on their ways of teaching and working when taking this perspective into account. I introduced them to new language that is being invented to describe psychological experiences of the climate crisis, with the Bureau of Linguistical Reality being one example. And just to mention, I will be circulating through Jasmine links to all the references that I'm sharing with you here. So the Bureau of Linguistical Reality is a public participatory artwork by Heidi Quant and Alicia Escott, which is collating new words and terms. For example, one of these is pre-traumatic stress. This is where a person experiences symptoms of trauma before an event takes place. And in this instance, when they learn more about the future risks of climate change and watch our world around us not taking necessary precautions. And I certainly observed this presentation of pre-traumatic stress in my own therapeutic practice. And I invited the academics to start creating their own words pertaining to their areas of practice. We also started deconstructing some of the limitations of existing therapeutic frameworks and exploring implications for education within their domains of expertise. For example, I shared that many people in my practice have told me that when they have sought support to talk about despair and depression due to the climate crisis, at best their feelings have been misunderstood or pathologized as unwelcome and feelings that needed to be reduced or eliminated. And so we explored alternative approaches such as honouring these feelings as healthy responses, healthy alternatives to numbing and denial, in that these feelings can inform committed action, which is more available when there is attuned therapeutic support. And this approach centres clients as active agents in their lives and invites them to come into relationship with difficult feelings as potentially powerful motivating forces for change. And this in turn can support people to face, feel and cope with difficult feelings, and to do so in a way that they don't become overwhelmed or disabled by them, or avoid facing the problems in order to avoid the feelings. We explored how perspectives such as these might influence the pedagogy and teaching within the university. Also raised with the climate crisis is a collective trauma, and collective traumas benefit from collective responses. So another theme raised was how the current privileging of individualised models of psychological care already leave far too many people without support. And so we started exploring what collective therapeutic practices might look like and how they might be incorporated into professional education and accreditation. And so I planned an experiential collective practice to have a direct taste of this. It was to be the orientation day for the academics, their start to semester one. We had all endured weeks of fires, red skies, toxic air, reports of decimated ecosystems. And so I had shaped what was intended to be a safe space to express and honour feelings about this, feelings that are all too often disenfranchised with few contexts for acknowledgement and support. The morning was meant to be a ceremony called the Truth Mandala, which is inspired by the work of Joanna Macy. Very briefly, it's a collective practice that supports people to safely engage with, express and witness feelings such as anger, grief, despair and dread. And the afternoon was to be a time of creative expression involving drawing, collage and weaving. And it was informed by the premise that responding to the climate crisis needs to go beyond supporting people to cope with difficult emotions. It must also engage the imagination for creating new stories of what is possible when we centre life-sustaining practices in our ways of being and doing. Regrettably, the event was put on hold as COVID started causing havoc overseas, and there were risks of students not returning to Australia and the need to pivot online. But it's a practice I have since offered in other community spaces. Another final event which did occur was an outreach public seminar for parents, grandparents, carers and educators of children and young people. Research conducted by the Australian Psychological Society indicates a high level of concern by young people about their future. And it shows that when us adults dismiss their feelings, this can negatively impact their well-being. Contrastingly, when young people can share about their worries, feel heard and supported to take action, this can boost resilience, self-efficacy and hopefulness. And so a key message for this public event was that young people, such as through the school strike, are asking us adults to stand in solidarity with them and to take action on behalf of their future. And it is important we empower them to be part of the response, to believe they can do something and then to help them to do that in age-appropriate ways. I collaborate with my local library and with Carol Wright, who's one of the speakers today, and other people from Psychology from a Safe Climate. And we created an age-appropriate resource list, which I'll share with you. And also just want to acknowledge Caroline Hickman. We've not met before, but your work has really been an inspiration and informed this offering to the community. So this was my first time ever of working with academics. I'm used to being the other side of the lectern, and I was like so grateful for the trust that was extended to me to shape this as their response to the invitation. It felt like a really useful contribution, and I'm so glad to have the opportunity to share it with you tonight. And I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you too. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mel. Next on our agenda, we have Luke Skinner, who's representing United Workers Union. Luke Skinner is an organiser at United Workers Union and the Secretary of Climate Justice Union in WA. He has an extensive background in communications, campaigns and organising with a focus on human rights and climate justice. At United Workers Union, Luke leads an occupational health and safety program focused on extreme weather at work, through which workers identify the impacts of extreme weather and climate change on health and safety in the workplace. This program empowers workers to understand their rights and ensure their own collective safety during increasingly common and severe extreme weather events happening right across Australia. Luke is also a state emergency services volunteer and hip hop MC in his spare time. I'll pass over to you, Luke.
Hi, everyone. So I feel like I'm probably a little bit of a oddball in amongst some of the people in the room here. In the work that I do is kind of very different than what I probably expect to hear from most people here. But following on straight from Mel, my story essentially starts in the bushfire season of 2019 and 2020 as well. So as Jasmine said, I work at United Workers Union. We are a union with over 150,000 members in Australia. We cover a wide variety of workplaces and types of work, everything from aged care, disability care, early childhood, right up to people who actually work in oil refineries that have just been made redundant in Mobil, in Yarra and Altona, through cleaners and gardeners, ambulance officers, security guards, farm workers, logistics and supply chain workers. 1 in 4 people in Australia is actually potentially covered by United Workers Union. So we have people who are affected by a lot of different climate impacts. So in 2019, 2020, we identified 16,000 of our members who were actually living in postcodes that were directly affected by bushfire, not including people that are affected by smoke in the cities, just in the places where bushfires were actually burning. And we contacted every single one of them to check on their health and well-being. and to offer them access to a climate disaster relief fund that we set up in the midst of those bushfires as a collective support mechanism so workers can help each other during moments of crisis. Yeah, so the impacts all the way from losing houses just to the stresses of not being able to see people, not being able to get to work, and then the trauma obviously resulting from being in a place where there's those kinds of things happening. But more broadly, climate change is having an impact on health and safety of workers all over the place. We run an occupational health and safety training that was created after the bushfires last year at the request of our membership. We started a climate action group after the bushfires last year because so many members were impacted, and that group decided that the thing the union needed to do as a number one priority was to organise occupational health and safety training to enable people to understand what their rights are and about their rights to cease work when there are imminent risks to their health and safety, which obviously extreme weather and the impacts of climate change often bring up. I know I don't have a long time, so I could talk for hours on what actually came out of that training and how we run it. But essentially, we put people into small groups, into breakout groups on Zoom, 4 to 5, and we ask them a series of questions in parts of it. But one of them we ask is, what kind of impacts might extreme weather have on workers in the workplace? And this results in them giving us impacts both at work and in the work and in their home life, because actually home life and community obviously have impacts on how you're able to perform at work. If you're unable to sleep at night, you're much more dangerous in the workplace the next day operating heavy machinery. And what I want to do is just quickly read out the top 20 impacts very quickly, and then hopefully leave that as something for everyone to kind of consider as the rest of the conversation has. Some of these are mental health impacts, some of these are just physical impacts, but all of them have implications for how we deal with people's mental health as these things become more common. So the number one impact was heat stress exhaustion. The second one identified was smoke exposure in the workplace. The third was that there was an increased incidence of workplace injury and illness in the workplace. As a general point, there was the fourth most common was permanent and temporary closures of workplaces as a result of extreme weather impacts. The first one that was just about mental health is number 5, which is anxiety about the future, particularly in relation to the future of their job and their work or the industry they work in. Number 6 is an inability to get to work due to accessibility issues. Temporary loss of income. Number 7, anxiety about the future in general, particularly as it relates to the environment and what we're doing to that and sustainability. And also that one includes people who are at work and who are witnessing the destruction of the environment as part of their work, people involved in land clearing and all that kind of stuff. Number 9 was threats to job security. Number 10 was increased levels of fatigue, which have a whole lot of safety implications and mental health implications. And then increased stress and frustrations leading to workplace conflict, arguments, fights, disagreements, and people having to work additional hours and do work that is outside of their job description due to emergency situations, people being exposed to dangerous weather, traveling to and from work. Number 15 was respiratory illness in the workplace, very specifically going up, asthma attacks in the workplace and people having them on the way to and from work. Number 16 is a really big one for mental health, which is actually about it becoming impossible to meet the existing performance goals and workloads and targets that people have because of the impacts of extreme heat, and people have a lot of worry about losing a job as a result of that. And the number 17 is one that is a really critical one that people don't often think about, that is our workers, our members particularly have an exposure to, which is home care workers, disability support workers and aged care workers getting separated from their clients from long periods of time during bushfires or floods, and not knowing if those people are actually okay, because those people are genuinely dependent upon the care that is provided for them by these workers. And the last 3 on the list of 20 is people being left with 0 personal or annual leave because they've had to use it up during emergency situations just to manage their life. Worry about extreme weather impacting their home or the community while they're actually at work. And that applies to their family when we say community as well, so family members in nearby neighbourhoods. And the final one on the list of 20 is a disproportionate impact on workers who are also volunteers, especially where they're volunteers in the emergency services. These people have a disproportionate number of injuries, illnesses, they lose more income, they lose jobs entirely, permanently, and again, they have all of their leave often used up at the end of doing a good thing for all of the rest of us as well. So I hope that brings a little bit of kind of what's happening now and a lot of the challenges that we're dealing with collectively in the workplace, and the individuals are dealing with individually as a result of the experience of extreme weather, which we all know is driven increasingly by climate change and is becoming more severe. And we actually recorded all of the extreme weather and climate change impacts members have observed too, and there's lots of those too. Thanks.
Thank you, Luke. Our next presentation comes from Suzanne Moser, who is a geographer who works nationally and internationally as an independent scholar and consultant. Her work with government agencies, non-profits, foundations, and other researchers and consultants focuses on adaptation to climate change, science policy interactions, effective climate change communication, and psychosocial resilience in the face of the traumatic and transformative challenges associated with climate change. Susie is the editor of 2 award-winning edited volumes, one on successful adaptation to climate change, the other on how to communicate climate change. She is a prolific writer and inspiring speaker and has served on scientific advisory boards for Future Earth, the International Science Council, the US National Research Council, and has contributed to the IPCC and US National Climate Assessments. Over to you, Susie.
Great, thank you so much. Can I present a couple of slides?
Yes, you have share screen, so you should be fine to.
Okay, good. So I love following on to what Luke just presented, because you just brought attention to the challenges for workers, for professionals. What I want to do is introduce you to a project that is also focused on providing psychosocial support and really leadership development, capacity building services. And it is directed toward the people that, Luke, you didn't mention explicitly, but it's the people who work on climate change day in and day out. So, you know, it starts from exactly the place that you describe with the fires, that you all know, and it's obviously not just in Australia, Western US, Russia, Brazil, just fill in the blanks basically by now, or your favorite flood or tornadoes or tropical storms or whatnot. That's what we all know. We also know that this is now in the news everywhere. Panu, who's on this panel, has written about it, and many of you, you know, that's why we're here, right? That this is now sort of a common conversation. Although for the people who work on this professionally, there are not a lot of places to go. In fact, I would argue that there are hardly any places. I have not heard of anything similar to, Luke, what you just described in Australia happening, certainly not in unions here and really not anywhere else. So the question that guides this project is really, who takes care of those who take care of us? In other words, the planners, the first responders, the people whose job it is to work on resilience or sustainability, the scientists, the emotional labor that they have been providing really, or have to take on, having studied climate change for decades and know exactly what is coming, or the educators that Merle, you mentioned, extension agents, community leaders, you name it, the people who work on the front lines of climate change all the time. The particular challenge that I've learned about through my work with them, in particular in the resilience building space, is that they feel their professional persona, their credibility would be undermined if they showed anywhere out in public how they really feel about what's going on. The world that they are facing, and that we're all facing, but they are needing to manage on a regular basis, I put into sort of 3 categories. They're overlapping, of course, you all know this, but you know, there are also distinct challenges that we always planned for a rather static environment or future. something that is similar to what we've had in the past. Now it's constantly changing. You cannot rely on that anymore. Obviously, the traumatic disruptions, that is not just something that you need to deal with in, in the community. You are often affected by it because you live in the very affected communities. And then increasingly, we have to lead people, or they have to lead people through profoundly deep changes, whether that's retreating from an area or changing livelihoods or whatever. That is not something they have been trained for. You go to planning school where you don't learn about psychology, right? This is not on your agenda. Or you go to engineering and you certainly don't ever hear about those things. So to me, it seems like we have to bring attention to the ones who need, who hold us, but who maybe need the most holding. I found this particular thing on Instagram and found that quite apt for the situation they find themselves in. So I'm in the process of studying adaptation professionals, people who deal with, plan for the future and deal with the impacts. And we found an 80% burnout rate, and this is among adaptation professionals in the US. And just to put this in comparison with sort of what do we know about burnout in the US, it's an epidemic to begin with. But 67% in the pre-COVID, I should say, in the US, and among adaptation professionals, it's 80%. There's a lot more to be said. I'm not going to have time to do that. We learn sort of what are the factors in that, but I think that's really significant. There are many, many people's colleagues of mine who want to leave this field, not just a job and go to another one like it. They want to leave the field altogether. What that means is that you have less effective, less experienced people coming in, or you don't have those positions filled. And that means you all don't get the protection of having someone be responsible for planning for climate change. I'll just give you one example. This is from an exchange I had with one of those extension professionals after an article about the growing suicide rate, something you didn't mention, Luke, among US firefighters in 2019. This is really a remarkable situation for them. But what this extension agent was telling me, she was quoting this particular line from the original article: when people call 911, which is our emergency phone number, they want someone there who's going to be brave and heroic and handle a situation. And then she translated that when people call Sea Grant, her institution, they want someone there who's going to be clear-eyed and objective and handle a situation. Easy enough, right? And then the next one, it's chronic repeated exposure to everyone's worst day. That was the quote in the article. And then she translated, it's chronic repeated exposure to everyone's raw and unfiltered existential dread. And again, she's not trained for that, right? This is the kind of situation they're facing. So what we're thinking about in this project is to build skills for what we call the adaptive mind, which is a set of propensities, capacities, and skills of an individual, but seeing them, Merle, I loved what you said, seeing them embedded in community, in social networks, in institutions that can respond with agility, creativity, resolve, and resilience to these stresses of constant traumatic and transformative change. That's sort of the most generic definition. So what we're trying to do in this project is to actually develop resources, trainings, retreats, you name it. And I don't know if you can see that, it's a little bit cut off, but sort of from if you think on the left-hand side of this spectrum being sort of the more educational and capacity building, and all the way on the right-hand side, this being more about the clinical interventions. Our project is truly focused on the educational capacity building end of the spectrum, because we're not psychologists, we're not claiming to be in the project. We have several, so we're informed by that, but it's clearly not trying to replicate what a clinician could provide. So this is just what we wanted to do, and the vision is that we have essentially through this, from a pilot building, scaling that up to really training professionals all the way into their graduate education, a set of professionals and leaders everywhere working on the front lines of climate change that have those skills and capacities and the institutional support to effectively and compassionately face these challenges and support others as they face the challenges of rapid, traumatic, and profound change. So that's what we're doing. And what's interesting is that we haven't gotten any funding. It's a little bit ahead of its time, but we constantly get requests for interventions, for resources. And so one of the things I put together is just a set of resources just to hand out to people so they have something. And increasingly, and this might be of interest to some of you, I get requests, how do I find a therapist who knows a thing about climate change? It's really difficult for professionals to imagine having to explain climate change to a therapist before they can get help. So I am so glad that we're finally having this community of practice and extending or connecting our networks and expand the capacity of the clinical field to respond to what's actually needed. So I'll stop there and look forward to questions.
Thanks, Susie. Our next presentation is from Tamara Stanton, who's representing Citizens Climate Lobby. Tamara Stanton co-founded her Citizens Climate Lobby chapter in Portland, Oregon in 2012 and stepped in as regional coordinator for the Greater Pacific Northwest a few years later, supporting leaders and expansion efforts in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Alaska, Hawaii, and 3 Pacific Island territories. In March 2020, she accepted a new position as Education and Resilience Coordinator, excited at the opportunity to integrate her background in education and personal development with the climate work she has come to love. In addition to her CCL endeavours, Tamara is a consultant, facilitator, coach, and educator with over 20 years of experience. She has worked with individuals and groups around leadership development, communication, team building, and improving overall effectiveness in the solar industry and beyond. She's passionate about integrating more joy into the climate movement and supporting leaders in building resilience and effective pathways to positive global change. In her downtime, you might find her backpacking, kayaking, or camping with her family, or strumming her banjo by the creek. Now, Tamara couldn't be here today, so she has recorded or pre-recorded a presentation which I am about to play for you.
Good evening. After 10 years as a volunteer with the Citizens Climate Lobby and 5 of those years on staff with CCL, it's become a huge part of who I am, a big part of my identity. And it is from this place that I feel so committed to providing for our volunteers as much as we can, supporting them in their internal experience that makes all of us really as effective as we can be in this beautiful place we call home. My name is Tamara Stanton, and I live in Portland, Oregon, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity to participate in this roundtable discussion with all of you, which from my position here is more of a share, and disappointed that I can't be with you live in the community. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. And as I mentioned, I started as a volunteer with Citizens Climate Lobby in 2012 when I started the 72nd chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby in Portland, Oregon. And from there, I took on the role of Greater Pacific Northwest Regional Coordinator. Just last year, I was offered a role in the education department and have expanded that role to include resilience building for staff and volunteers. Our mission as CCL is to build the political will for effective climate solutions, specifically focused on passing national carbon pricing legislation. We do this through the empowerment of volunteers, enabling breakthroughs in their political and personal power. We've been advocating for one proposal for more than 10 years, and many of us face legislators who are opposed or just unsupportive of the legislation, which, as you can imagine, is a long slog that takes a lot of hard work and focus and education and continued resilience. So we have identified 3 areas of focus around personal resilience building within CCL. The first one is to empower all staff and volunteers to be engaged and effective in their climate advocacy and leadership efforts. We also want to support current volunteers and staff such that they're motivated to stick with CCL through the highs and the lows. And we are very committed to attracting new and diverse populations of volunteers and staff as well. There are many things that CCL does well as an organization. Just to highlight a few, we are guided by 7 core values, specifically in regards to resilience. We do a good job of creating a nonpartisan culture of optimism, focus, and strong relationships. We support people who experience feelings of helplessness, as you can imagine. Many of our volunteers feel deep alarm and fear about the multiple ravages of climate change. Active volunteering definitely helps with that, but for many, the feelings of impending doom are ever present. And we help people to get in action. And as we like to quote from Joan Baez, action is the antidote to despair. So in many ways, we already attract volunteers who have higher levels of resilience, those who have already accepted the reality of change, who focus on what can be done and in meaningful conversations, engage in meaningful conversations and action, and also those who may be eager to join with others to build in community, all which contribute to deep resilience. But despite our strengths as an organization and whom we attract, they're naturally areas for growth for us as an organization. Our volunteers are not immune to the psychological impacts of climate change, such as trauma and depression and alienation, not to mention chronic low levels of stress from worsening climate impacts. With every passing year that we just don't have effective solutions in place. Processing emotions is difficult. I know that goes without saying. We make space both online and in local chapters for the opportunity to process, discuss, and make space for authentic experience. And this happens most effectively in communities where we're already comfortable. So in addition to what I've previously mentioned about building resilience, we currently have a number of specific programs that help support our volunteers. So we have trainings, webinars, workshops, podcasts, reference guides around topics containing to resilience and self-care and facilitation. We have a resilience hub that serves as a one-stop collection of all of those resources, as well as some practices and other resources that can help groups bounce forward. We have affinity groups that we call action teams that enable like-minded individuals to come together and work on particular aspects of climate advocacy. We also have a resilience building action team, which is a specific affinity group specifically towards supporting volunteers in their resilience building. We have local groups or chapters, as we call them, which function as a place for taking action in community, also providing friendship, camaraderie, support, and social interaction, all of which tend to grow interaction or resilience as well. And then last but not least, we also have monthly staff social time, which creates for regular time for leadership to come together and play and connect. So in the future, we envision further developments around our current offerings, as well as integrating more resilience into the culture of CCL so that it is more accessible by more volunteers, more prevalent. And also, we're excited about the idea of resuming and building out our in-person climate camp workshop retreats, as well as a 10-step grief program that we are currently in training around with the Good Grief Network. So in closing, I just want to reference Rumi from the 13th century, and that is to fully experience the benefits and the beautiful benefits of sorrow, really, one first needs to recognize and accept it. Creating safe and brave spaces for our volunteers to be present with and express their authentic experience can serve to guide our volunteers in a transformational way so that really deeply aligns with our mission. So thank you so much again for inviting me to be a part of this roundtable discussion and idea share. I'm disappointed that I couldn't be here live with all of you, but I'm eager to listen later and hear from my colleagues who are here in person tonight, live, I should say. So if you do have any questions, don't hesitate to ask Peterson or Jeff over chat or live time as time allows, or simply reach out to me directly with your thoughts, ideas, or questions. I'm definitely eager to learn more about what you do and how we can collaborate together as a global community in this climate space to inspire and enable effective action. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your night.
So we'll move on to Dr. Panu Pikala, who's an adjunct professor of environmental theology at the University of Helsinki. He's the leading Finnish expert on interdisciplinary research about eco-anxiety and participates actively in public discussions. Among other positions of trust, Pikala serves as an advisor for the Finnish National Project on Social and Health Sector Responses to Eco-Anxiety. Pikala has published monographs in Finnish about eco-anxiety and ecological emotions, and his research articles in English are often cited by scholars from a wide variety of disciplines. Pikala leads workshops on related themes and often collaborates with artists. Over to you, Panu.
Thank you, Jasmine. Greetings to all. Very nice to connect with you. I'll share a couple of slides also. So here we are. There's a couple of us Finns participating in this session. So we are at the very northern part of Europe. If I had put here a global map, we would be sort of invisible. So at least on the Europe map, you can see us. This is what it looks like at its best. Sort of lots of coniferous trees and lakes due to the ice ages. This is what it sometimes looks like with sort of prevalent methods in forestry. So speaking about ecological emotions, Finns have a lot of them in relation to how the forests are used and treated. So I've been doing multi and interdisciplinary environmental studies, mostly in Finland and partly in the US. Since the beginning of 2015, I've been focusing on what I here roughly call eco-anxiety and the wide spectrum of ecological emotions. I led my first workshop on eco-anxiety in 2010, but I was finishing my dissertation on environmental theology. So I have a background in religion and ecology, actually, but the interdisciplinarity has been a big part. I've been doing theoretical research, but also practical work in environmental education. So glad to see many people involved with children and youth and adult education here today. And there's the workshops and discussion groups about eco-anxiety. But because there's many of us today, I want to keep this relatively short. There's three main things that I want to share. First, something about this national project that we have in Finland about eco-anxiety, especially for the social and health sectors, but also for the broader society. That's the website in Finnish. Google Translate is amazingly good with even Finnish nowadays. So actually, if you use Chrome browser, you can just right-click on the pages and translate it into the language of your selection. Second is a significant educational project we've had about difficult emotions related to global issues. The project has been called Hope and Action, or actually Toivoa ja toimintaa in Finnish. I proposed meaningfulness and action, but that didn't go through. And I share a bit about my personal work on ecological emotions. So in Finland, we've had a growing national discussion about ympäristöahdistus, which is our term for eco-anxiety since autumn 2017. I've been very much part of that discussion. It's been interesting to meet people from a wide variety of sectors in society. We have gathered also some interesting empirical data. I'll not speak about that much today. That's for another meeting. But we do have a national survey on climate emotions done in summer 2019. I was heavily involved in the preparation of that together with climate psychologist Kirsti Jylhä. We asked questions related to 26 emotion or feeling words. 25% of the Finnish population over 15 years recognized some kind of climate anxiety in themselves. We asked first about anxiety in the emotion word list, and then also the question that how well do you think that the word anxiety describes your feelings towards climate change? And the youngest segment, 15 to 30 years, over 33% of the population of that age answered affirmatively. Strong psychosomatic symptoms were self-reported by from 3 to 10% of the population. But that's for the empirical data. Now, from 2020 to 22, we have these national projects, especially on the social and health sectors. There's 3 organizations. Leading one is Mental Health Finland, a very old mental health organization. And then there's Nyti, an organization for young adults welfare, and a new NGO, Tunne, which focuses mainly on ecological emotions. This is funded by the Ministry of Social and Health Affairs. It took some preparation. I was much taking part in that also. But luckily, after so many difficulties, it was not easy either in Finland to get funding for this kind of work. But now we have a level of national recognition where we can actually get funding for these kinds of projects. This is, of course, great. There's 3 full-time persons and an advisory board. There's a website which includes many kinds of information, also articles and review articles, tips for coping and so on. I'm just preparing a blog post for some details about this in English, so that's gonna come pretty soon. There's also information about social support, online chats, information about discussion groups and so on. And a major aim of the project is to further raise awareness in society about the dynamics related to what is here roughly called eco-anxiety and climate anxiety. Now, the second example is this Hope and Action project. For theoretical background related to that one, and a supplement which describes a workshop for teachers. If you want, you can take a look at my article from December called Eco-Anxiety and Environmental Education. So that's a sort of broad review of literature related to these topics, and then some practical recommendations based on that. In the projects, we developed activities and materials about emotional skills, especially focusing on climate emotions for my part. Most of these activities are unfortunately currently only available in Finnish, but once again, we have the services of algorithms and Google Translate at our disposal. I've translated part of this in my blog, so you'll find some of that there. This is an example of one of the methods we've been using heavily called mind map of ecological emotions. So a spontaneous writing with the help of an emotion word list. This one is in the blog mind map of ecological emotions. And then finally, just some info about my own work. I've been much involved in the aforementioned projects. And as Jasmine already said, I've done these 2 monographs. I'm sort of in pain about what should I do about the English translations of them. So let's see. The activities for practical situations, I already mentioned the mind map. Another one that I've been using heavily is called Spectrum Line of Ecological Emotions. That one is also available in English. So it's the, I think many of you have recognized the method of doing an invisible line in the room and then moving among the line. And this enables also peer group discussions and so on, but you'll find the details if you want to check it out online. That's the address for the blog. For varieties of what is called anxiety in ecological distress, I did a wide review of that last year. The article is called Anxiety and the Ecological Crisis. There would be interesting things to discuss in relation to that, and the insights already provided by the previous speakers, but I'll not go into that now. For dynamics of climate grief, there's a brief essay I did for the BBC from last year. Most of the stuff related to my ecological emotions books is only in Finnish. And then finally, there's a couple lecture videos about climate anxiety and coping, and also COVID-19 available in English. The list can be found at this blog post, which is and anyway, you can have the slides later on, so you can find this. So this is the situation that we want to avoid. Don't know if you have seen this, it's from a cartoonist in the US, the cemetery for guilt-ridden environmentalists, no longer contributing to global warming. Don't blame me, I'm dead, and so on. So this resonates much with what Susi was saying, and I've also been working with the topic of vicarious trauma and environmental researchers. So very much resonating with the aims of this whole conference and network about the importance of validating difficult emotions and moving forward from overly strong positions of guilt, shame, or despair. But that's my speech for today. There's some contact details. Like I said, lovely to connect with you, and I'm looking forward for the questions and discussion at the end. Thanks.
Thanks, Manu. So Tamara's colleague, Peter Toscano, is actually available to complete Tamara's. So I will hand over to Peterson now.
Thanks, Jasmine. Hi, I'm Peterson Toscano with Citizens Climate Lobby, Citizens Climate International, and Citizens Climate Education. I live in Vattenfallboven in Mpumalanga in South Africa. And with Tamra and others, we've been working on a resilience hub for our volunteers, particularly right now in the United States, because they've been engaged in a work of trying to promote bipartisan legislation on climate change. And as all climate work, it's not for the faint of heart because it's grueling, and they're going into the offices of Republicans and Democrats and trying to come up with something that they would all agree on, or at least enough to pass a bill, in particular to decarbonize our economy through carbon fee and dividend. And so we have over 200,000 volunteers who are regularly engaging with members of Congress and their staff. So our big goal with our resilience work is to empower all volunteers and staff to be engaged and effective in their climate advocacy and leadership efforts. Secondly, it's to support our current volunteers and staff so that they are motivated to stick with our organization through the highs and the lows. And we've been through lots of highs and lows politically, and to attract new and diverse populations and volunteer staff. My role at CCL is I'm a storyteller, and I do our monthly radio program and podcast. And one thing I've noticed with our volunteers is they experience a great deal of grief. And that grief keeps them trapped at times. And so working with Good Grief Network and other sources, we're trying to help people process that grief so they're not carrying it with them into congressional offices. And of course, when coronavirus hit, it got extra grief landed on top of grief. And here's a very short video about some of the voices that we bring in to speak with our volunteers about these kind of issues. I just need to do a proper share here.
I think about other moments of collective grief, like 9/11. There isn't this one moment with Corona, but still everyone has a story to tell.
A lot of the deep-seated questions that come to the fore with climate change around who gets to adapt and where the funds go and on what terms and what kind of future we want to build. Those are the same questions that coronavirus is forcing us to ask.
Women have a heavy burden in climate change in several ways, but then there's also a heavy burden that women face when it comes to coronavirus. Both climate change and coronavirus are suspected to be associated with violence, potentially domestic violence.
It's feeling that grief or the other feelings that come along with a loss, rage, deep sadness, despair. There are many feelings that come along with the realization that our systems are failing us and that we need to co-create new ways of being in the world together.
We've been looking at feelings as kind of this roadblock to get through, or to, dust our hands off and say, I don't want to feel that, or feelings are somehow a weakness. And I think we're realizing that they're actually a gateway for deeper and more efficient activism.
We as a society need to get much better at facing grief.
But when I'm angry and when I'm in despair, there are a certain number of things that I do. And one is that I really have to knock it into my head that we're not alone. And that's why I think of everyone together as a source to offset that anger.
We are separated, but we're still so much connected. It's something that is keeping my spirit up under this terrible uncertainty.
And just really grateful to have this opportunity to learn from all of you. And thank you, Jasmine, for making this happen.
And thank you for stepping in so last minute. Lifesaver. So we are moving now on to Bella Broadway, who's representing Climate Justice Union. Bella lives on Wajok Noongar Buja in Bolu. For the last year, Bella has been working with the Climate Justice Union to co-design tools and processes to support the emotional, social and mental health wellbeing of CJU members and the wider climate justice community. As the CJU Wellbeing Worker, Bella's role is to create support pathways, capacity building training, resources and connections that can help climate activists look after themselves and each other, and to support the mental health sector to better understand and respond to the unique and intersectional needs of climate justice activists and supporters. Over to you, Bella.
Hi everyone. My name is Bella. My pronouns are she and her, and I am from the Climate Union here in Boorloo, which is Perth in Western Australia, and I'm currently the Wellbeing Officer for Climate Justice Union. During this session, my internet wasn't playing nicely. So I'm just doing a post record of some of the information that I was talking about during the session. So for the benefit of those that are watching this recording, you're able to hear it a little clearer. So to give you a bit of a history about some of the work that we've been doing at Climate Justice Union and how that evolved, CJU from its foundations was really working in a trauma-informed way, looking at how they can build mental health and wellbeing into the work that they were doing and into the communities that they were serving. Then when the onset of the pandemic happened, CJU found that their volunteers, members, key organisers and the wider community in Perth and Western Australia were really struggling to deal with both their activism, their work, but also that intersection with the effects of the pandemic and also several natural events that we faced in terms of fires, flood and extreme weather. So CJU went to the Suicide Prevention Coordinators here in Perth and were lucky enough to get a little bit of seed funding to engage my organisation to do a co-design process. So through this co-design process, we worked with key members of this Climate Justice Union, both with folks that had a lived experience of mental health and accessing mental health supports and services, and also other people that had key skills, interests, knowledge, and networks and connections in the area. So the project was designed to deliver accurate and safe mental health and wellbeing messaging to members, to model and teach resilience, to deliver evidence-based training to prevent suicide or promote mental health and wellbeing, and to increase awareness of safe and reliable referral pathways, both into CJU and out of CJU. So it was really about designing those policies, procedures, process, tools, resources that CJU could use to support the mental health, social and emotional and cultural wellbeing of members and of the wider activist community. So I'll just walk you through some of the key outcomes of that process. So we delivered START online suicide awareness training to CJU members to give them the skills to talk safely about suicide, both to help them in times where if they were thinking about suicide, that they were able to talk about that clearly and directly to seek support, but also if they recognise that colleagues, peers, fellow activists or members may have been struggling, how do they actually practically have that conversation with them and connect them with supports. So we also delivered support and connection seeking resources, including wellbeing meetings, spaces where members could come and connect with one another, often around times of potential effect on mental health. So key events, if there were climate reports being released, lots of discussion in media during the state election, during periods of fires and flood, and also key dates and for community members that were part of marginalised communities, really recognising that those compounding traumas associated with the intersections of people that were members were really important to address and try and build resilience and support into those moments as well. working to thread mental health practice throughout all meetings and events. So practical things like starting all meetings with a check-in and a check-out, providing resources during meetings, developing and piloting burnout boundaries and self-care training that's specifically for climate justice activists or people working within the space. Encouraging CJU activist networks, so other states, local and national groups and agencies to also develop their policies and practices around mental health and wellbeing. Ensuring that CJU lead staff and organisers are supported with debriefing, accessing EAP services and counselling and supports to keep them well and resilient, acknowledging that they're doing a lot of that in-time direct support for membership. And through the CJU and CAWA connections in the mental health and suicide prevention sector, a lot of work is being done to encourage key organisations and bodies to look at how they can better understand the complex needs of climate justice and the effect on mental health. This ongoing work was then driven by the appointment of CJU engaging a wellbeing officer, which happened to be me, which was great to be able to continue this work and really build on the foundations that this co-design project delivered. So I just want to share some of our learnings and our thoughts around our future directions and priorities in this area, thinking about the leadership and development of mental health supports. So one that has become abundantly clear is really ensuring that intersectional cross-section of voices and lived experiences are represented in all the work we do in the mental health and wellbeing space, making sure that First Nations mob voices are heard, that disabled folks, LGBTIQA+ folks, culturally and linguistically diverse folks, people of various ages, genders, living in various regions, really making sure that as we build these systems, supports and resources from the ground up, we have an opportunity to do this in a way that makes sure that all members are supported in a way that is culturally safe. Ensuring that sort of pop psychology or a white privilege lens isn't shoehorned into an activist context, but rather that we have the opportunity here to build systems of support, both peer supports and therapeutic sector supports that can support the diverse needs of the community. That we consider that the lack of privilege is exacerbated by the climate crisis, by weather events, by resource levels, and by global pandemics. And that's really why this intersectional approach to climate justice is so vital to the work that has been done at CJU and is continuing to be done now. That components of community care are built into responses, and particularly when working with the notions of self-care and resilience and hope, in acknowledging that sometimes those individualistic responses actually don't fit the frameworks of people's lives, so that we're building models of community care and ever-growing networks of community care that can support all folks involved in doing this type of advocacy and work. One of the big things is really how do we make sure that what we're creating is accessible, that we're using plain language, that we're avoiding jargon, that we're making tools and supports and resources that are practical, even down to what are some actual sentences I can say if I'm responding to somebody. What are the words that I can use? Giving people very practical tools, not just information. That we recognise that all systems of oppression are connected, and that when we work towards justice and equity, we're engaging in suicide prevention. So really seeing this intersectional lens as an opportunity, not only to be able to make sure that the mental health supports we're building are appropriate for all of our members, but also just by the nature of making sure that they're intersectional, we're able to build the capacity of the membership and wider activist community to build their knowledge around different marginalised communities that they might not have had an understanding for. And acknowledging that when we create safe and inclusive places and spaces, that's actually part of suicide prevention. That's actually part of keeping our members and community healthy, well, and resilient. That we need to build the capacity of climate justice activists to give themselves permission to take action in different ways. And we need to really work explicitly in that, to acknowledge that their personal capacity will be different at different times. And this is especially so in relation to consuming media and social media and helping members be able to navigate doing that. Acknowledging that guilt and shame is really quite linked to a climate activist identity, about not doing enough, about stepping away in times. So how do we actually help people grant themselves permission to actually adjust how they engage in the work according to the capacity that they have in any one given moment. We recognise that context is everything, and that those who are part of taking on climate action work often work in close and interconnected ways. So traditional approaches don't always work because they don't address those grey areas. So really, when we looked at existing system structures of support, trainings, really acknowledging that there were significant gaps in those in the actual practical application, because often they're for workforces, they don't speak to the experience of volunteers, of maybe working in across sectional ages, so older members of the community working with quite young members of the community, and how do we navigate those things in a way that is realistic and practical? Similar to lots of other kind of peer spaces. We acknowledge that the scale and scope of this work is way beyond current resources, and I just want to be upfront in acknowledging that we have done a lot of work at CJU, but this work is often ongoing, especially because we're addressing the in-time support needs of the membership, as well as trying to build our systems and structures. So the wellbeing officer position is currently 1 day a week, but as you would acknowledge, all of you in the work that you do, we could have 10 wellbeing officers working 7 days a week, and the need probably is only going to be ever growing. So starting to think about how do we resource this, how do we share, how do we build connections with people working in this space to make sure that we're all actually building each other's capacity to continue to actually meet the needs where they are. We're seeing a lot of activation in this space all of a sudden. And I think for a lot of the work that CJU has been doing, it's been quite internal. And so we're seeing that there's all this work being done, and it's become a bit of a hot topic. So we really have to balance that sense of urgency, that we know that the need is urgent, but we also know it's important to get this right, that we have an opportunity here to build from the ground up, and make sure what we're doing actually advocates and demands for best practice and actually meets the reality of people working in this space, volunteering in this space, that it actually meets the needs that they currently have. So in a nutshell, the work that we're doing and our future directions are all about that building capacity for individuals, for peers, for the mental health sector to actually understand these emerging trends, and that they're going to be seeing this more and more in the people that use their services. So how we can bring them into the fold and continue to build their capacity to develop their understanding, especially for those folks that are really intensely involved in work around climate justice and in activism and community support. And then of the wider systems. So really speaking to that, how do we work together? How do we work together well? And how do we use peer review kind of approaches to make sure what we're doing is best practice? So that's a bit of, in a nutshell, where we're at the moment and where we're looking to go to. Really excited to hear what's happening worldwide, and to really see the goodwill that comes from across many time zones today, multiple people giving of their time from across the world, some of us at 4 o'clock in the morning, some of us at 10 at night, some of us having worked a full day, and some of us engaging in this space before we go off to care for others or do a full day's work or study. And I just want to acknowledge that that's really hope building for me in terms of knowing that there's people in this space across the world who are ready to stand up together in leadership and really think about how we can make a difference to keep people able to engage in their activism and work, but also in a way that does them no harm. Thanks very much. And please get in contact if you'd like to hear more or share some of the work that you're doing too. Thanks, everyone.
So our next speaker is Psychologists for Future. And we've had a last minute change from Dr. Monica Krimmer to George Adelman. So I don't have a bio, but I'll hand over to George and you can start.
Hi, thank you. Okay, I'm Georg, I'm a psychologist. I think that's all you need to know about me for now, except I'm with the Psychologists for Future and Psychotherapists for Future since 9 months. But there's 1,000 people more to introduce, so I'll get started. And I'm not going to manage to do that. But as an NGO, we're active in Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and the Netherlands. So that's where activists come from who are active with us. And let's see that I can actually, yeah, right. And I couldn't include all the pictures of all the people, but I tried with some at least. So this slide is a bit busy, I apologize. So it's around 1,000 people. We are all volunteers. And we are on our way to become a registered NGO within the European Union right now. And I'm one of the 3 board members, so here we go. That's a lot. That's a lot of people to handle, and lots of goals that we actually have. Our main goals, and I try to be specific to the topic of this webinar, is we want to support the Fridays movement with helping to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees of Celsius. Or even lower if possible. And to do that, as psychologists and psychotherapists, what we can do is we can contribute our psychological and therapeutic expertise and experience, and I'll later tell you what that means. And we also support climate activists and groups. So both the individuals and the groups are something that we focus on. How do we do that with 1,000 people, you might ask? And I hope you do, because here's an answer. So we have regional groups in lots of different areas and all the countries which I mentioned, and they do local stuff. So they talk to politicians and so on. We have teams on the other side who work on certain topics, on keeping the whole organization actually working and all the people interacting smoothly with each other. And they all like meet as a council of delegates, and there they elect a board, that is me and the other people, and they also like write down, okay, how do we want to work together? We are very much self-organized, and we try to keep it that way even as an official NGO, which is exciting. And yeah, so that's basically how we try to set up the organization in a way that it actually works, and does work so far, since we're still growing rapidly, so that's great. So to keep it working, we do have some administrative teams, which is necessary. We have the board, the council of delegates, which you can actually see in the picture. That is one of our delegates meetings like a few weeks ago. That's how it usually looks. Lots of people, lots of topics. We do have a group focusing on self-organization, we just released a handbook on how to work self-organized within the groups, within the NGO, stuff like that. We have thankfully volunteers who do office work, who take care of finances, and we have people who take care of tech and homepage stuff. So without all those people, all the other amazing stuff would not work, because we have also a social media team, or rather several, for Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. We have a group for each of them. where we try to connect people, support groups, advertise events and petitions, and we offer content about psychological and climate relevant topics. That actually relates to what other people have been thankfully highlighting before me here, like talking about emotions, how not to suppress emotions, how to deal with them, how important and powerful they can be once you actually know how you can use them in an efficient way. That is something where we try to inform the wider public, the whole Fridays movement, and thankfully we are becoming more and more publicly known as people to ask if you have questions in that area. And that is so important that not we as an NGO, but we as a profession actually speak out and give our input publicly as well. And this is the most public site we have. So right. Coming more to the support area, what we do is we support activists. So we offer counseling for free for activists in as many places as we can. And lots of psychologists and psychotherapists, thankfully, are quite interested in helping activists from the Fridays movement and from within our NGO as well to maintain their spirits, to not burn out, as some others have been pointing out before here. That is a huge, not only danger, but reality that we have to face and that we have to deal with. And we're trying our best to mitigate some of the issues that can happen and helping individuals to deal with that. We do knowledge management, where we actually try to share knowledge within the NGO, probably even with the wider population. We're working on that. We have a share and care group, which is basically for our own activists to take care of each other, to talk about difficulties, about emotions, about needs, about stuff that actually always comes up when you do activism for a prolonged time, which is so important, as others have pointed out already before, that you're not alone, that there's other people experiencing the same thing, that there are, I'm not sure if there are solutions, but there are strategies to deal better with it, and to take care of yourself and to help you take care of other people as well. We have an awareness group specifically for conflicts within our group, because with 1,000 people, you can imagine there are conflicts coming up sometimes. And we have a group really just dedicated to dealing with those conflicts within our NGO, but also within the Fridays movement, where we offer some supervision, some counseling and stuff like that as well, which for them is quite important. We do cooperation like this one, like with international stuff, where we try to give our knowledge, share experiences, bring people together, or just give our input if asked. We help with communication, because that is something that we have experienced from the psychological side. How we talk about the climate crisis, how we write about the climate crisis, how journalism writes about the climate crisis and deals with it, is something that affects the emotional aspects, and that in itself then affects how urgent we view the tasks ahead, or that we don't. So words matter, and we try to bring that to the journalistic community, to all people who are talking and writing about the climate crisis. And we also support psychotherapists and try to make them aware actually of the eco-anxiety, of the climate crisis anxiety, all the stuff that goes with it, that actually creates a challenge in psychotherapy, where it's good to talk about how do you deal with an anxiety that your client has, that you yourself do have as well, because there is an existential threat on the horizon, and it's not imaginary, so you can't just talk it away, and you shouldn't. And your client has the same problem that you have, so how do you deal with that? And we're trying to find ways and talk about that with the whole profession, actually, in Germany mostly. So yes, we do have regional groups as well. They do awareness raising activities. It's placards, it's flyers, stuff like that. They also support the local Fridays movement, and they support local activists. And that also can be counseling, can be helping with messaging, stuff like that. We also do discussions with politicians. That is an amazingly empowering tool. that where you can actually like starting to discuss with people where you feel like, okay, they're not from my Twitter bubble, so they probably have a different point of view. Like if they are, I don't know, conservative politicians, stuff like that, probably have a different point of view than most of the climate activists. But starting that discussion, getting to a middle point, or getting them to see our point of views, and probably understanding how we can help them understand our point of views, is so important. Can't stress that enough, and that is something we need to do to keep up the pressure and the political movement, because it's not only about the pressure, it's about actually doing something that is done on a political level mostly, and that is where we need people to get. So yes, and we also do workshops on sustainable activism, which is one of my favorite workshops I give, because, as I said, quite challenging. If you want to look us up, last slide, we do have an English part of a webpage where there's some information about us. There's short videos introducing us. There's also some more background and some on, for example, social psychology and climate crisis, where you can read up on some stuff that we published as articles. We do have very active Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram channels, but they are mostly in German. So Google might help with translating, or some other page you prefer. So yes, that is the Psychologists for Future, and what around 1,000 activists are doing right now. Thank you.
Thank you, George. As we move forward, I'm not going to be reading out bios in order to save time, but all bios are available on the agenda. So as we move into the adult individuals and group support, we now have Psychology for Safe Climate and Carol Ride, who will be presenting. So over to you, Carol.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for all the wonderful work that everyone's doing. It's so interesting to hear about it. I'll just tell you a bit about the work we're doing. One of our chief activities is running workshops for climate activists, for people working in the space as scientists or researchers, policymakers. And we run our workshops on predominantly on acknowledging climate grief, but also on beating burnout and as the climate is changing, how are you? Are the three topics that we offer. And these are 3-hour workshops that we run with using art materials, pastels and a large sheet of A3 paper, and we run them in groups of 5 or 6 with facilitated by one of our members, who are mostly psychologists and psychiatrists and psychotherapists. And we give people a chance to express their feelings in this small group and talk about what they've drawn by giving them some prompts to get going, and talk about their what their their drawings reveal to them, and talk about that with each other in the group. And we find that, as you probably expect, that people feel very relieved to express themselves, to find that they're not alone, to find that there are links between the drawings that they've created and those of others. And particularly with people who are, say, from the same workplace. We've done this with groups of scientists working, we're dividing, you know, there might be 20 people all together in these groups, but they feel really so relieved that others who they're working with day on, day out, who they've never talked about their feelings with, are actually carrying the same weighty distress and grief that they're feeling. And similarly, with people who are in community climate groups, they often are so focused on the activism that they don't actually talk about what they're feeling, so it's very helpful to them as well. In our workshops, we include work on in self-care, usually mindful self-compassion, because we find that's a very helpful mode for helping those who are working so stridently on this issue and are really needing some care for themselves, and it's a very good reminder in that process. That's the work of Kristen Neff that we usually use. We're looking for ways to deepen our workshops to go to another level with people, so I'll be interested to hear the contributions from others that might give us some ideas for how we can go deeper with people in the workshops. The other area that we're working on just this year is developing a climate-aware practitioners network throughout Australia. We're only a small group of about 10 people, but we've got connections with people across Australia, and we're now trying to grow a network where people can use our website to promote their activities and awareness about climate change. We're going to provide a membership process for people to be able to join our network, which includes them doing some professional development, which is addressing this issue that people were raising about whether the people who are offering a service to the public around climate distress are actually attuned into climate change themselves. So we're offering some professional development around that, which is a requirement for them to join the Climate Aware Practitioners Network. The network will include mental health practitioners, general practitioners, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mental health workers, and also a network of workshop facilitators. The professional development will consist of facing climate change in the therapeutic space, which will be an interactive webinar, attending one of our workshops on coming to grips with the climate reality, and another seminar on presenting issues about addressing climate distress. They're our main two activities at the moment. We also have a number of publications. The one was written around the bushfires at the end of 2019, called Staying Engaged in the Climate and Bushfire Crisis, to offer emotional support to people affected by observing and witnessing the massive impact of those bushfires, as well as those who are impacted by them. We have others, book publications, Facing the Heat, Stories of Climate Change Conversations, and our very first publication, which was Let's Speak About Climate Change, which was around about 7 years ago. We produced that way of a booklet around understanding some of the psychological issues around climate change denial. And another one, Coping with Climate Change Distress, which we created with the input of the Australian Psychological Society. So we also write submissions to government inquiries around mental health and climate change, or when climate change is not mentioned in mental health inquiries, and we alert them to the need to actually include it. And we also give lots of talks and seminars around climate distress. So we'd be really happy to make contact with others who are doing work around this sort of area, so we can learn from each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carol. Moving on now to Climate Psychology Alliance, and we have Caroline Hickman who will be presenting. Over to you, Caroline.
Thank you, Jasmine. And thank you for organising this. Please ignore my messy desktop. Just trying to try and get it up before everybody sees the mess. So I'm speaking on behalf of the Climate Psychology Alliance. We're largely a UK-based group. However, we have a happily, energetically developing international presence and relationships. So I'm going to do a number of things. I sent Jasmine a message saying, I'm really sorry, I can't just talk about adults. And she said, don't worry about it. So I'm going to talk about our systemic work, the work that we're doing largely with adults, and also some of the work with children and young people. I'm a researcher academic at the University of Bath, and my work for the last 7 years has been researching how children and young people feel about the climate and biodiversity crisis. And I'm dedicating this, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit before I move on to listing the work of the Climate Psychology Alliance. And I'm going to be dedicating this to the children and the young people and the animals and their silenced, disallowed distress, and to really name that process of othering that is endemic, I think, in the world when we talk about climate, children, animals, and the planet. And I'm also going to bring some of their narratives in. A 14-year-old said to me, humans always create what they're most afraid of, and we always fear death. So humans are creating our own death in the apocalypse. Another child said to me, climate change is like the Avengers Endgame. It's like Thanos, whose ideology is to kill off half of life in the universe so the other half can thrive. He said, but the trouble is, he said, we're the half being killed off. This is a child in the Maldives. Another child said to me in the UK, climate change is happening to rebalance something that was out of balance. Another child said to me, climate change, he said, I'm sad, my friends are dying. He said, my friends, the fish are dying. So I want to start with their narratives because I'm very aware, and this is not a criticism, but I'm hugely aware, as I'm sure all of us are, that we are, generally speaking, technically, chronologically, a group of adults here talking about distress that is impacting hugely on children and young people. It's not a criticism. So I've been talking with children in Bangladesh, Nigeria, Maldives, the United States, Brazil, Europe, and I have a psychotherapy practice that, thanks to Zoom, is now as large as many people coming to see me from the United States as the UK. And I know eco-anxiety itself can be a bit of a disputed term, but it's incredibly useful as a sort of way for young people and young children in particular to start to frame their distress. And I'm working with children and young people who are suicidal, self-harming, in a despair, which is really hard for them to bear. But what they often do is frame this through their relationship with the other, with relationship with animals. So I have to introduce this other that's in the room, in case you hear the sound of a dog snoring or coughing, which is all, both are quite possible, because he's really not far from us today. And I also need to mention this guy. This is the Bramble-Key Melanie. I can't do a talk without acknowledging him. He's the first mammal to go extinct because of human-caused climate change. And I think we need to grieve him, and we need to look at him, and we need to know that this is what we've done, is lead to the annihilation of creatures like this. We've lost many, many other creatures. But when I'm talking with children, I'm hearing the grief and the pain and the distress aligned with the loss of the planet around them. Children and young people, I'm sure people here understand, have incredibly different psychological, emotional defenses against this despair to adults. So children and young people are talking to me about environmental collapse and embodying the pain of that, but they're also relating that to collapse in their relationship with the adult world. There's a collapse in trust. There's a collapse in trust and belief in adults and governments. There's a collapse in attachment relationships. There's a collapse in these young people's ability to navigate the changing world. And there's a feeling of abandonment, of traumatic betrayal and abandonment in relation to adults. So this is relationally connected. It's not just distress about environmental collapse and environmental degradation. And the Bramble-Key Melanie is extinct because he lived here, and this is off the coast of Australia, and rising sea levels have inundated the land because it's their planet too. And these are the young women in the Maldives. I'm allowed to show you their pictures. So I just think we need to just keep in mind what we're talking about when we're talking about children and young people. And they're in trouble because the highest point in land in the Maldives is 3 meters above sea level. So it's already too late for the Maldives. Even if we went to zero carbon emissions tomorrow, it would be too late. The amount of carbon in the atmosphere will continue for that sea level to rise. So for these young people, this is an immediate trauma. We're not talking here about pre-traumatic stress. We're talking about post-traumatic stress. I personally think there probably is no one in the world that isn't struggling with eco-anxiety. But the Climate Psychology Alliance uses a depth psychology approach, as do I. So we're talking about how that distress is pushed into the unconscious. So I'm just bringing it back to this ancient human truth, this quote from James Hillman, that humans cannot be studied or cured separate from the planet. So I want to just briefly run through some of what the Climate Psychology Alliance is doing. So as we can see, we've been in existence 10 years with the slogan of facing difficult truths. We're a group of psychologists, psychiatrists, psychotherapists, academics, artists. We're very broad. Anyone who's interested in a psychological understanding, we work very systemically, very psychosocially, and very much hold at the center of this work the thinking about cultural collapse, about internal psychological, emotional collapse, as well as external collapse, and the importance of being able to talk about both. We have groups in America, Australia, Portugal, France, Sweden, Russia, and strong connections, colleagues here today, Germany, Finland. So some of the research that we've been involved in has been direct research with climate activists, different interventions to mitigate against despair, to reduce some of the distress around mental health and resilience with groups of scientists, with different organizations, and with, particularly for myself, the children and young people. Organizationally, Judith Anderson, chair of CPA, who's here today, and Therese Staunton have been very active for many years, trying to bring this into professional trainings, particularly for psychotherapists, with the UKCP and BACP, and are making headway, but it's taken over 10 years. We've been doing a lot of organizational consultancy work with groups such as Greenpeace, working with activists, working with NGOs to help them frame emotionally and psychologically the work they're doing, and to look at what I want to describe as an internal activism and the emotional depth that's needed here and the movement inwards and downwards, as well as externally. Chris Robertson in Climate Psychology Alliance has developed a program to hold psychotherapists and psychologists as they're moving their practice from one-to-one work in the practice room through the door. He calls it through the door program. So it's not training so much as enabling, supporting psychologists, psychotherapists to think outside the consulting room. I now say I never work in a binary way, in a dyadic relationship with myself and individual clients. Half my psychotherapy practice now is made up of people distressed about the climate emergency, adults, children, and young people. But I always now say that I work with a triad, with the people and the planet. We have a therapeutic support service with over 60 therapists signed up, prepared to offer 3 free or low-cost therapy sessions, and some will extend this for longer to anyone who makes contact with us. Rebecca Nestor has been establishing a program of climate cafes. We've been running these in developing them in universities, environmental groups, conservationist groups, government groups, health, mind, public, children and young people. We've got our first climate cafe for young people happening in a couple of weeks. And Judith and I did some climate cafe support psychology work with groups of climate scientists, all older white men, last year. Fascinating to sit and talk with these men, and for me to reflect that all the narratives that they were sharing with me exactly mirrored the narratives I'm hearing from young people and youth activists. They were saying the same thing. Nobody listens to us. We feel despair. We don't know what to do with our feelings. So specifically the work of the Climate Psychology Alliance around children and family groups, we're working with a lot of schools. I do endless talks in schools with teachers. I was invited, I have to tell you this, I was invited to give talks this week to Eton College. There is a cultural shift happening. There has to be, for me to be invited to speak to Eton College. And there were 200 14-year-old boys on the call who were concerned and interested. I don't quite know what to make of that, so I'd be very interested to hear what anyone else thinks. I've been running parent support groups for a number of years, calling it parenting into the Anthropocene. It's not very catchy, but talking about parenting differently, using a climate crisis lens to think about parenting. Personally, I do a huge amount of work with youth activist groups, talking about mental health and resilience. We're working with the Royal College of Psychiatrists, so more systemically, with CAMS, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. Judith has strong links with MedAct, with health professionals. I do a lot of work with conservationist groups as well. So we're really, and the podcast, really trying to get this sort of public conversation to shift the narrative to a depth psychology understanding of what can happen when this distress is pushed into the unconscious. I'm going to finish with a quote from another child who said to me, he said in the Maldives again, he said, we saw online that people in Iceland had a funeral for a glacier. He said, this was beautiful. He said, but we're going to be underwater soon. We're going to be dying soon. He said, who's going to have a funeral for us? So I have to end with that child. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. We are moving on now to the Deep Adaptation Forum. Matthew Paynton and Dean Walker.
Hi there. Thank you, Jasmine. And thank you to everyone who's spoken so far. It's so rich. My name is Dean Walker. I've been connected with the Deep Adaptation Forum since its inception a couple of years ago, and had the luck and good fortune to have Matthew Paynton be a co-moderator with me in one of the subgroups of that Deep Adaptation Forum. The forum has gone through quite a bit of change, and it has always been a much smaller group than the Facebook group for deep adaptation. And so many of you may have heard of or be participating in deep adaptation work, but let me just go back a moment for those of you who might not know about deep adaptation to just say where it came from. An academic in the field of sustainability leadership, Jem Bendell, posted a paper. He wasn't allowed to have it posted in the professional journal, so he posted it himself. It has since gone on to be immensely popular and downloaded, and it's the paper is called Deep Adaptation, and at its core, it is about what he's calling deep adaptation. And what he essentially did was say that the emperor has no clothes in that way about the sustainability leadership field, that there is no sustainability in sustainability leadership. So that was the emperor's having no clothing point. He went on in that paper to say that we are in some amount of collapse now, and we have much more to come. It is in fact imminent. And that seems to be really the crux point of his paper. He's certainly not the first person to see that collapse is occurring and that it's coming, but to have that professional stance and for him to speak so boldly a truth that needed to be heard, in my judgment, that's what's drawn close to 15,000 people to the greater organization that obviously at its center includes the Facebook presence. And the crux or the cornerstone of what I believe the Deep Adaptation organization is about is to generate not only a safe space where people can come in and feel these awkward and often terrifying emotions together, but that they can also work together to generate loving alternatives to the default emotions and reactions that you've all been talking about so articulately. I would say that the primary offering of deep adaptation to the general public is the offering of what is now called deep listening or deep relating. And that's basically a slightly adapted circling or authentic relating practice. You may have heard these terms for opportunities and methodologies for people to come together for whatever purpose. But obviously this one is really geared for the collapse-aware community. There also have been putting on some decolonization workshops and also some death cafe workshops. But in just a few moments, Matthew's going to speak about the many other offerings that just seem to be spontaneously combusting, coming forth from the general community of deep adaptation. I'd like to speak just very briefly about my own work. I've been at this work for more than 10 years and wrote a book about this stuff called The Impossible Conversation back in 2017. And it was around that time that I was also putting on online symposia for the collapse-aware community with a woman who may well be the most prolific author in this field, Carolyn Baker. I would recommend highly, if you haven't dug into her work, that she's a rich resource for the very issues that we're talking about. My own work is in livingresilience.net is the name of my website, and I'll be including a number of the links into the document that I believe Jasmine is putting together for us after this thing so that she can send out. And there's, for instance, for deep adaptation, there is a tremendous Wikipedia page that is one of the most concise and informative Wikipedia entries I've ever seen. So it's easy to find. Facebook and the deep adaptation community couldn't be easier. With, again, my work, the elevator pitch for my work is to offer transformative support and resources to people bravely facing human-caused collapse of Earth and human systems. And really the key to that is the word transformative. While I do offer a tremendous amount of entry-level skill set, you know, for instance, self-regulation and co-regulation skills, the likes of which has been offered for years at the first aid level of resilience skills, like the community resilience model that Elaine Miller-Karras and her crew in LA have been putting out for years. I'd recommend it highly if you're looking for just really easy to grasp and to convey at the basic level of resilience skills. Also, Bob Doppelt's Transformational Resilience, his book called Transformational Resilience, is a more advanced level, really post-traumatic growth oriented skill set. So I just wanted to mention those elements as well. I also know some of the faces here because of my podcast, which is the Poetry of Predicament. And it is also meant to serve the collapse-aware community, especially through transformational methods. And so it's been a pleasure to be a part of this. And I'm going to hand off the last minute or two to Matthew, whatever you'd like to add. Matthew is, again, a very strong contributor to the deep adaptation community.
Yes, I have some slides to share. It's difficult to talk about deep adaptation guidance, deep adaptation, because it's a sort of multi-platform. There's a Facebook community. There's the free offerings for around deep relating that Dean mentioned. A project that I've been part of is the guidance website, which is a database of collapse-aware practitioners. And we have psychologists, coaches, shamans, yoga teachers. The point is that they're committed to a loving response to collapse. They can make a profile, and we're starting to lean into self-organizing peer support and intervision. As a coach, I've been sort of bringing forward the deep adaptation coaching aspect. I thought this would be interesting to the group, that it seems that most people are, you know, committed and obliged and immersed in business as usual, but at some point in their being, some place in their being, this global predicament is trying to surface. But it's frightening, unpleasant, and our nervous system, if we're adapted to business as usual and the individualization there's not space in our life or in our being, and we don't have capacity or the nervous system to surface a global predicament. So we end up in avoidance, distraction, and cognitive dissonance. So that's where most people are. And so the change and transformation that's needed doesn't even get a look in, because, you know, all our energies evolved in managing this. So interestingly, that as a coach, I started developing this as a diagnostic tool, and then as a generator of pathways. That there are 5 elements to surfacing a global predicament in your being. There's the feelings component, grief especially, the mental component of air. We're all saturated with information, oversaturated, and the system is becoming more uncertain. So how do we find meaning? The fire element is justice and injustice, and how that ignites people. The earth element is the sort of physical work on material resources. And the spirit element is making space for the global and reconnecting with nature, with the cosmos, with spirit. And we've seen the Deep Adaptation Network sort of start to organize around these. So this is what's going on in the individual, but it's also happening at the macrocosmic level. So we're seeing the organizations self-organize around these different elements. Yeah, and the other point to mention is that each element has a shadow. So in the shadow of the feelings is the numbness or hysteria. The shadow of the mental realm is misinformation, which there's plenty of around, and false certainty. In the justice work, we know that activists burn out. It's very consuming to be inflamed with that sense of injustice, especially over the long haul. So we know that burnout happens, infighting, etc. The shadow of earth is materialism, competition and rivalry, survivalism. How am I going to survive regardless? And the shadow of spirit is spiritual bypassing. The reason I want to highlight that is we all have these shadows going on, and my fear is that that's going to, in the collective, that's going to erupt as ecofascism. So it's really important to name that shadow element and deal with it within. Yeah, so the Deep Adaptation Network is organizing around these elements, and it's interesting to see how they speak to each other and either don't gel. You know, a lot of people say deep adaptation is about physical adaptation, never mind the spiritual stuff. Or people that are sense makers really want to sort of understand and make sense. But the point is that these are all co-arising equally. We can't just deal with one element or the other. Yeah, so I think that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Dean and Matthew. And we're moving on to working with children and parents. And to start off with, we have Frida Berry-Eklund.
Thank you, Jasmine, and hi, everyone. My name is Frida Berry-Eklund, based in Stockholm, Sweden. Primarily mum of two. Also been organising on climate change since about 2008, working on these issues for quite a long time. But when I had children, this issue became really personal to me. And in the wake of that, started organising with other parents. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the initiatives that I'm involved with. And I know two of my colleagues as well that are involved in this climate parent work are also going to speak in a few minutes. So I'm going to try and keep it brief, but I'm also going to share a short presentation. So I can't see you now, so you have to holler if you can't see this. I have also written a book called, it's called Prata med barn om klimatet, and that's a book about how we can talk to children about climate and the climate crisis. And I wrote this book.
Frida,
you can't see it?
No, we can't see it.
I am screen sharing. Let me just see. Let's see. Does that work?
Yeah, that's good.
Great, perfect. So that's the book book cover, and that's me. But basically, I wrote this book because I found it really difficult knowing a lot about this topic and what it actually means and the seriousness of the problem. I found it really difficult to know how I could talk to my own children about this. They're 6 and 9 today. So I started digging into it, and I've been really inspired by quite a few people on this call and their work on this topic. So I decided to pull it together into very kind of practical handbook that could be useful for just normal parents, but also for teachers. It's written in Swedish, unfortunately, for now. I'm also involved in this, Våra Barns Klimat, and that's a Swedish climate parent group. We've been organizing since 2012, and we mobilize about 26,000 parents here in Sweden, really pushing for political change and systemic change. And in 2015, we started thinking in advance of the Paris COP, the Paris UN climate meeting, there must be more parents like us out there, and we should be joining forces, we should be doing something jointly and collaborate and learn from each other and support each other as parents in the Anthropocene. So we started something called Our Kids Climate, and that's an international platform for parent groups where we try to connect and amplify and do things together on this issue. And the groups that are part of this network, there are about almost 60 groups now across 23 countries, are really focused on kind of parent-led or family orientated campaigning on climate change. There's also a sister network called Parents for Future, and they sprung up, of course, supporting the youth that were mobilizing on the streets. So there are kind of two big parent networks collaborating to really bring in and wake up more parents to this really pressing issue for our children. So just really briefly on this book, I mean, a friend of mine who's a journalist working a lot with children and have been doing that since 2008, I spoke to her about this, and the most common question that she gets from children is this. So not if, but when will the world come to an end? And that kind of was a starting point for a lot of the work that we've been doing here in Sweden on this topic. I'll just share briefly with you an example from my home country. So we've done a survey last year looking at the issue of climate anxiety in children. And to summarize, we see that children are really worried about this issue, and they do lack hope for the future. And the latest numbers that was produced in this survey was that 6 out of 10 children in Sweden feel really worried about climate change. And also a 1/6 of those don't talk to anyone about their feelings. So there's a lot of kind of loneliness connected to this issue as well in our children. Only half of young people, and this survey was between 12 and 18 years old, feel hopeful that we'll solve the climate crisis. It's also connected to a lot of feelings of not just worries, but really kind of a hopelessness, thinking about what the future will mean. And there's a lot of calls that have been increasing as well. We have a national children's helpline here in Sweden, and they've also seen an increase in the complexity of the issues that are brought up, where climate change do feature quite heavily. And climate anxiety is described as kind of really intense, but also constantly present. So I've been digging into this question when I wrote my book. So how can we talk to children about this crisis? How can we do it in a way that's constructive? And of course, the spoiler is that talking to children is not enough. We also have to act, and that's a real key lesson for me when I've been writing this book. But there are some kind of pointers to how we do this. And in terms of preschool children, I'll just talk about this really briefly, but preschool children, it's a lot about focusing on nature connections, understanding nature, being out in nature, connecting with nature and ecosystems and animals, really kind of laying the groundwork for empathy with the world around us. This is a difficult age to talk about for children who obviously are not experiencing it physically, but even things like a 6-year-old can't really understand that a forest fire in Australia is not going to mean that our house here in Sweden is going to burn down. So there's a lot of things that are difficult and can be really scary for children at this age that has to do with climate change. 7 to 12, roughly, that age, you know, it's really about kind of really start telling the truth. But there's also positive things in here about like curiosity about the topic. And we need to be really mindful that we do tell the truth, but in conjunction with also hope and pointing to solutions that a lot of adults and people and companies are doing everything that they can to solve this issue as well. And really focusing on kind of collective solutions, so not putting the blame on or focusing too much on what we can, like more cycling or personal things that we can do. I mean, this is a massive problem that is going to require a massive shift in our values, in our attitudes, but also in our societal structures, in our economy. So really focusing collective solutions is really important, even at this age. And then, of course, for teenagers that are really aware, they're really knowledgeable about this issue, as a parent, it's really important to kind of keep asking questions, to tag along if they're really involved or engaged in school strikes, for instance, but also to help them find like-minded, to kind of avoid this loneliness that can sometimes be a real issue for young people. So finding the collective strength even here. And just 3 short things what we can do when we talk to children about climate change is to start with an open question. How do you feel about this issue? What are you thinking about it? What do you know about it? Do you know about Greta? And what does she fight for? So starting with an open question kind of allows us both to kind of gauge how much they know, what their sources are, but also kind of gauge how they are feeling about this issue. Are they feeling hopeful or not? How can we support them through where they're at in their emotional response to this issue? The second one is about telling the truth. So not kind of try to curve around it, but we really have to be honest with children, even young ones, and say that it is serious, but we can all contribute. And every step that we take in a positive direction is good and will help. And the third thing that is really important, that of course this community is really aware of, is really to make space in conversations for emotions, like talking about how we're feeling, how does it feel in our bodies, and really helping children naming those emotions. And that is a very good starting point for then kind of using those emotions to get more involved and to find ways to get involved in this issue with our children. A few things to be mindful of in the conversations that we have with children as well. To saying this, everything will be okay. We know it's not. And we talked just now about deep adaptation. We know that there's a whole host of things that will happen no matter if we stop emissions today. So saying everything will be okay, it won't. It will be different, and it is really serious. So we need to avoid saying things like that to our children. And then, of course, talking without action. So a lot of children are experiencing this, where they learn about this issue and they know how serious it is, but they don't see enough action. And that can be from their parents, but also wider community. So talking without actually acting with our children or without them, if they're not worried, like it's really important that adults take on this issue in the next few years that we have to really tackle this issue head on. And then the third look at is nagging. I'm guilty of this, talking a lot about this issue at home, to the point where my 9-year-old finds it really annoying and thinks that I'm constantly talking about climate change and nagging about it. So that's also another point to look out for. And I will stop there. And if you want to connect with me, my name on Twitter and Instagram is Klimatfrida, but you can also find me, of course, through Our Kids Climate and the resources that will follow after. I will stop sharing there. Thank you.
Thank you, Frida. Now I'm aware of the time and we have 2 more presentations to get through. So once those presentations are finished, I will sort of close the webinar, but leave the space open for an extra 20 minutes for anyone who can stay around for sort of questions and discussions. But I understand if anyone needs to leave at that time. So I will pass on to Harriet.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. If you can't see my screen, let me know, but otherwise I'm just going to launch in and say thank you to you and acknowledge the deep and broad foundation that we clearly have and that you've brought together and that we can see around the world. And so I want to speak to that as someone who has been working in the space, the parent space. Climate Mama was founded in 2009 to represent and lift up the voices of parents, to talk to parents about the climate crisis, and then to be able to advise them on ways to speak to their own children. And I think that we have arrived at what Joanna Macy calls the great turning now, that we are at another space and another place. And as Frida said, I'm pleased and proud to be an advisor with Our Kids Climate. Climate Mama was one of those founding members. I am on the advisory board with Climate Psychology Alliance North America, that Carolyn has, one of the many groups that has spun off from Climate Psychology Alliance. And so this idea of dealing with and talking to and coming to grips with the reality of the climate crisis is being felt, as we've heard throughout today, by people in the space that are working on climate. Many of those are also parents, and also by many parents just coming in to the space, and the importance of, and we've heard this from many already, this intergenerational allyship. And as Dean was talking about, and many, we are going to be living the climate emergency, excuse me, for the rest of our lives. Our children are bringing the intersectional aspects of it to the forefront, the environmental injustice, the racism. We're seeing all of these things come together, and we need to address them. So our work at Climate Mama focuses on these three core things: telling the truth, actions speak louder than words, and not being afraid. Many of the same things that have been said already: trusting in science, being age appropriate, the power of the collective, as opposed to, and in connection with the power of the individual. Who are our trusted messengers? How do we come to terms with the reality we face? How do we move through the grief to the hope and the resolve? And again, we're hearing it from our children. And so, and as we saw, from the children in the Maldives to the children in the UK to the children that are experiencing the bushfires in Australia, they are experiencing and living climate change firsthand. We can't protect our children from it, and we're coming, having to find the words, as many people have talked about today, right? Create the language so that we can talk to them, but also to address the parents themselves. And I think that also in this past year, as the world has lived COVID, and we've experienced, certainly here in the US, I'm coming to you from New York City, the racism and injustice of what the COVID crisis has brought on, the injustice of vaccine inequity we're seeing around the world. We have learning opportunities moving forward in our language about the climate crisis and the hard things we did to work through this, and the hard things we'll have to do to address and move through the climate crisis. So I talk about this a lot in my book, and I really want to just mention that the book itself has won 3 national book awards in the US in the parent and family category, parent and relationship category, not in the environment category. So I think, again, that shows that we as a collective are needed and at that turning point, because there is a much bigger audience than it was before. And I want to stop now. I have more slides and other things, but I want to give my colleague Jill an opportunity to speak, and then I will share the full slide deck with you, Jasmine, but let me pass it over to Jill and stop sharing so that we can wind up more than less on time. Thank you.
Thank you, Harriet. I'll pass straight over to Jill.
Hi, everyone. I do actually have a presentation. I'm going to do just a few slides from it. So I will share that now. Okay. Thanks, everybody, for holding on for a few minutes. So my name is Jill Cupid. I run a climate storytelling project called Dear Tomorrow, and I also help co-lead the Our Kids Climate Global Network that Frida was talking about. And I just want to briefly kind of introduce the Dear Tomorrow project. So since we already spoke about kind of the climate organizing that's taking place globally with parents. So a brief background to me, I've been working in the climate space since 2005. And when I had my child in 2013, I became really increasingly frustrated with the public conversation on climate and the fact that we just weren't talking about it, and that we weren't making any progress politically in government, in many governments around the world. And so I co-founded a project called Dear Tomorrow. And the basic premise is to ask people to stand in the year 2050 and to reflect and think about somebody that you care about. It could be your child or grandchild. It could be yourself in the future. It might be your community. It could be a niece or nephew, but to really think in a very personal way about somebody or something that will exist in the year 2050. And then you're having a conversation with them about what you did now about the climate crisis. And so what we wanted to do with this project is really give people this idea that from a legacy perspective that, you know, at the end of your lifetime or in a period of time, we will be asked about what we did for the climate crisis. And so we put, in 2015, we created a website with basically no money, and we put it out to the world. And I've been working to build this project ever since. And so what we discovered is that through this project, people were willing to share with us kind of these very deep thoughts, these tensions that they hold, their hopes for the future, you know, their fears, and also they're talking about, you know, what they're willing to do, especially like in the context of somebody or something that they care deeply about. And so we started hearing from people who were writing to, you know, multiple grandchildren or to their own child or a niece or nephew, and also many students writing to themselves living in the future. They run from being a few sentences to a few paragraphs long up to, I think the longest one is probably about 10 pages that people have shared. And we have just over 2,000 letters that have been collected from more than 50 countries. So we have found this theme or these ideas do speak across many different kinds of locations. And what we've also discovered is that community groups, organizations, groups of friends have kind of taken on the project kind of in small groups to do this in their local context. And so we've had schools and teachers, university professors, faith communities, groups of friends, environmental groups, environmental justice groups, community organizations kind of take Dear Tomorrow in small groups and kind of use it as a tool to organize and to share experiences and share emotions within their communities. And then we found that people have then also taken the messages and found ways to kind of share them with the public. So this is a free project. We let kind of any group or organization use it and adapt it. And then people kind of take the project and do what they want to do with it. So we've had people do public readings. They've used it to train organizers. They've used it in political meetings. You know, they've used it really to build community within their organizations, and also for people to really understand what their climate story might be, and to be able to give people the tools and resources they need to kind of share that story and to be able to talk about climate change. These are just 4 examples of people submit to us. And so these are all, you know, in some cases, this is groups where we kind of co-organize something with them, but in many cases, these are just images or things that people send to us who have participated in the project. The last thing I want to just briefly mention, and because I'm very cognizant of time, and I could talk about this project for a very long time, is that in 2019, we put together our first installation of the project. So we see this as, in many different ways, this is an individual kind of, an individual like reflective process to deepen engagement. This is a community organizing tool. And also this is kind of a public art and installation project. So we curated the material and invited 50 people to submit their audio recordings, original audio recordings of their letter. And we created an interactive audio-visual experience on Governor's Island in New York City. And I think we're going to share about 2 minutes of the audio, and then I'll be done.
It's going to be harder to find your favorite foods. The grass you play on is going to turn more yellow every summer. The trees and the animals are going to act strangely. The city in Peru, where you were born, where your mother's from and your grandma lives, is going to have less drinkable water, more seawater, and more mudslides. How can I look at your bright eyes and light dance and tell you we are facing a war?
That my little efforts are irrelevant, given the scale of the change that is needed. It's such a poor excuse. I feel ashamed as I write it.
I'm ashamed to say that we and I might fail you. I don't want to fail you. It makes me sick even thinking about it.
I don't know if it will be okay. I don't know. And I don't know what your life or your potential kids' lives will look like due to climate change.
I don't know if my efforts on climate.
I don't know what your world will look like. I don't know this letter. I don't know how much habitat loss has happened.
I don't know if my efforts.
How many.
And I don't know what your life or your potential kids' lives will look like due to climate change.
I didn't know it was a problem.
We just don't know how much time we have.
And so I'll just wrap up in saying, so that's part of a 46-minute loop that runs that features about 35 of the letter writers. And the last slide that I was going to share was just a very quick slide about what kind of resources are available just for this community and for people who are interested in partnering. One is that we have the website and anybody or any group can kind of participate. You can just use it on your own and just submit the stories on the website. The second is we do have a toolkit for organizers that we've developed. So we have kind of like the step-by-step of how you would organize kind of both in a digital format and also an in-person format. And then the third thing that we're developing that I would love for anybody to contact me with is we're working on developing a 90-minute and hopefully also a longer facilitated workshop that really allows people to think about, we have 3 key questions. Like one is to think about like who would you write to and why. The second is to imagine kind of what is the future you would like for them. And then the third one is to talk about the actions that you're willing to do to kind of make that future happen. I'm really very interested in adding in another question, which gets more at the tensions that people feel and kind of the emotions. But we have not yet done that because we really feel like we need to do that in collaboration with this community. So anybody who's kind of interested in helping us as we're developing and shaping and creating that facilitated workshop, please be in contact with me.
Thank you, Jill. And I want to thank everyone who stuck around. It's been an ambitious task bringing everyone around the world together to speak. So I'm going to conclude now and then keep the room open for another 20 minutes for anyone who can stick around and be part of a discussion. But before we conclude, I want to recognise both the Climate Justice Union here in Western Australia and the Scholars Warning Initiative, who I'm representing in this collaboration today. I want to thank all of you for attending and those who have presented for your valuable time in this space. And I want to thank those of you from the different time zones where this webinar has taken place during your personal time. In the coming week or so, I'll be distributing a resource package that has documents and resources from all the presenters today, the Scholars Warning paper that inspired this initiative, and the recording of this webinar. I welcome any feedback or comments from all of you, and I encourage you to use this webinar as an opportunity to connect with each other. So I understand if people need to leave, and I will keep the space open for anyone who wants to ask any questions or be part of a further discussion for the next 20 minutes. Are there any questions that people have for any of the presenters today? I have the chat box open, and I just wanted to give people an opportunity to speak up if there were any questions. There are a few questions about your art project, Jill. Did you want to come back on and sort of speak about as an installation or sort of future hopes?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm going to be totally honest about the project. So, you know, it's a really big project. It's kind of an overwhelming project with lots of requests. There is very little funding, and what we've discovered is there's very little funding in the kind of the entire like arts, climate, storytelling world. Even though people talk about it, there are very few mechanisms to actually do this. So the project is very much kind of done, you know, led by communities and by organizers. But we are looking for like major public spaces for installations. So I think on the installation side, there's like our hope or desire is to bring this to the MoMA or, you know, a major museum or the Smithsonian or a major institution, and do this in a really big way and be able to partner with sound artists and installation artists. The other part is just to give the project to communities for people to develop whatever exhibit or storytelling or community engagement work that they want to do, with the hope that it's replicated in many, many different locations kind of collectively.
Thanks, Jill. So I haven't received any other questions, so I'm wondering if maybe it's worth leaving it there for today because we are over time, and there will be the presenters' contact details in the resource document for anyone to sort of reach out and have further discussions after today. I'm sure there'll be lots of reflection and questions that come up over time. So without taking too much of your time, thank you very much everyone for attending, and thank you to all the presenters who came and presented the amazing and inspiring work that's been done around the world.